In Briar Ridge, where the sidewalks curled like ribbons around manicured lawns and the cul-de-sacs wore their symmetry like pearls, Ethan Vale had tried for months to unlearn the habit of listening for the hollow echo of an empty house. After the divorce, he had chosen this homeowners association-ruled enclave, not for its rules but for its promise of order. A tidy fence to lean his grief against, and in the small garage, beneath a window that captured the late orange wash of sunset, sat the last undeniable tether to his father, a dusty blue ATV that still bore the imprint of that man's careful hands on the handle grips. Ethan would spend evenings polishing it, tracing the faint scratch on the fender where his father once tipped in a creek bed, breathing in the gasoline and the earth and the memory of laughter that used to rise with the engine's roar in the timber country where he grew up. In those nights, the ache in his chest would loosen just enough that he could sleep. He drove the ATV rarely, usually before dawn on designated trails outside town, making sure he was never a nuisance, but in Briar Ridge, noise rules were measured with the same severity as broken windows. And from the day the moving truck pulled away and he uncoiled an extension cord across the driveway, Karen Mallory, HOA president and keeper of the Covenant's brittle heart, had taken up residence directly opposite his front porch within the frame of her scowl. She was all sharp sweaters and clipped emails, a soldier in the service of quiet and control. And inside her beige house there was a girl with a bright face and restless eyes, Sloane, who flickered in and out of sight like a moth at the edge of a porch light, and who sometimes skated in circles at the cul-de-sac, headphones on, circling boredom as if it were prey. After Ethan's first week, she left a printed copy of Clause E, line 12 on his door, a prohibition against unauthorized motorized vehicles operating on association property, and, though he told her politely he never drove on HOA sidewalks, that he stored the ATV with fuel caps sealed and chain-locked inside the garage, that he was mindful, she gave him that smile that wasn't a smile and said, "We've had problems before," and the note kept arriving anyway. And then came small things, a warning about a bucket left by the hose, an anonymous photograph of his recycling bin with the lid askew, the kind of petty vigilance that makes a person feel picked over. Ethan tried not to bristle, tried to be neighborly, waved when he saw Sloane in the street popping her skateboard, and almost laughed when she grinned at him with conspiratorial mischief. And he thought sometimes how a teenage girl growing up under a microscope learns to vanish or to explode. On a Saturday morning in early autumn, when the air smelled like cinnamon dust from the craft store and the HOA planned its annual harvest social, Ethan rolled the ATV a few feet into the driveway to wipe down the seat and grease a squeaky chain, and music drifted from his phone, something his father had loved, a bluegrass run that made his hands the hands of a younger man for a minute. That's when Karen marched across with a red clipboard like a flag, the cleat click of her heels broadcasting war, and said, "Mr. Vale, we've discussed this." And Ethan looked up and answered calmly, "It's not running." "Karen, just cleaning." And she said, "Appearance matters. Certain things invite certain elements," and he thought, not for the first time, that she wielded words the way some people wield knives. And then Sloane, drifting near on her skateboard, watched them with a vacant gaze that was not really vacant at all. That afternoon the social unfolded with paper lanterns and ladles of chili, neighbors leaning into small talk, toddlers tumbling in blown-up bounce houses that coughed hot air, and Ethan stayed at the edges, tasting apple cider and trading a shy smile with his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who told him stories of her garden as if she were offering sanctuary, while across the lawn he caught Sloane sneaking glances at him, at the grease on his nails, the easy tension in his shoulders, at the way he didn't flinch under Karen's watch, and he suppressed the urge to nod in alliance because he knew an alliance with a child could be used against the child. The week after, on a dusk the color of tea, Ethan came home to find the garage door slightly ajar, the padlock twisted on the concrete like a knocked-out tooth, the chain snapped, and a sudden emptiness where the ATV should have been that carved his breath into a gasp so raw it felt like swallowing a burr. He stood there with the fluorescent light buzzing and the chilled echo of his father's voice rising up. "Always check the lock twice, son." And his palms went cold and then hot, and then cold again. He called the police with his phone shaking, and the dispatch operator asked him a litany of questions that felt like a narrowing corridor. Make, model, distinguishing marks. And he answered them as if reciting a prayer he didn't know he knew. What he didn't tell her, not then, was that after those skirmishes with stern letters and Karen's arched eyebrows, he'd tucked a compact tracker, one of those tiny, Controversial little coins. From the hardware store beneath the ATV's seat because he'd lived in the world long enough to know that sometimes caution is not paranoia but wisdom. And as he waited on the porch for the patrol car's sweep of lights, he opened the app and watched a small dot blink into motion across a map like a heartbeat. In the shimmering, jittery lines of the interface, the dot pulsed into the neighboring development first, as if whoever had taken it wanted to vanish into the maze of sameness, then arrowed toward the disused gravel yard near the utility substation, the place where teenagers sometimes drank stolen sips and kissed and left the glowing stubs of cigarettes that darkened into nests of ash. And Ethan's throat tightened as he realized it wasn't a professional thief out to strip the frame for parts, but something more local, more intimate and humiliating. By the time Officer Cantu pulled up, a man with tired kindness folded into the creases of his eyes, Ethan had already pointed to the dot and said, "It's moving. It's there." And the officer frowned but didn't dismiss him and radioed backup. They drove at cautious speed into the thinning evening. Ethan's hands clenched and unclenched on his knees, memories flickering through him not as nostalgia but as weight, and he thought of how his father would bark a laugh and say, "Well, son, looks like we're going to go get it." And that brought a sting to his eyes. He blinked away. As they turned onto the rough road by the substation, the air turned gritty, full of dust kicked up by spinning wheels. And there it was, the music of a straining engine and young laughter, reckless, enormous with itself, and a flash of blue jumping the ruts like a water insect. Sloane Mallory, hair streaming behind her under a borrowed helmet, screaming out a whoop that tried to stitch fear into thrill, rode Ethan's ATV as if she had always ridden it, as if it belonged to her in some secret language. Behind her, 2 boys hooted and another girl held up a phone filming, the lens hungry while scribbles of tire tracks scarred the dirt. The patrol car's lights erupted into a red-blue tremor on the scrub, and the teens turned as one, and Ethan stepped out before Officer Cantu could caution him, hands out, voice low, the way he spoke to a spooked animal on his father's farm. "Sloane, cut the engine, please. You're going to hurt yourself." And the girl swung around with her elbows cocked like a bird ready to launch and shouted, "Relax, Grandpa, it's just a ride." And he wanted to say, "My father died. I'm not old, I'm just tired," but he kept his voice even and said, "It's not yours." And she tossed her chin and half laughed, "You left it, so I borrowed it. Anyway, Mom says you can't do anything. We know people. We're untouchable." And with that childish hubris, she throttled the engine and tried to pivot away. Officer Cantu called out, Hey, kill the engine, sweetheart. This is not the hill you want to die on." And for a second you could see the fragile calculus in her bright, frantic eyes, the way fear and bravado wrestled like feral cats. And she did not cut the engine. She peeled away, sending pebbles spitting under the ATV's wheels, and one of the boys, smaller than the rest, had to hop sideways to avoid being clipped. And the phone girl lowered the camera and swore softly. Ethan stood with air punching out of his chest, torn between wanting to rip her off the machine and wanting to kneel and talk to her as if she were his own, and the ground beneath them could still hold. Officer Cantu radioed something quick and urgent, and then his voice changed to stern. "In charge, the music teenagers pretend they can't hear." And 2 more cars arrived with more lights, emptying their twirling color onto the dirt, and suddenly the party looked like a crime, like a scene pressed into the dark ledger of these kids' histories. When Sloane finally misjudged a rut and the ATV bucked sideways into a ditch with a thunk that sent a shock up Ethan's spine, she spilled off and skidded. And for a heartbeat the world stopped so they could all decide to be gentle or not. Ethan was running before he knew he was running, mud slapping his shoes. And he reached her as she pushed up to her knees with stunned tears in the corners of her eyes that she tried to blink away. And he held out a hand and said, "You okay?" And she slapped it aside and stood on her own and said with ferocious dignity, "Don't touch me." And then her phone rang in her pocket, and the name Mom flashed like a lighthouse scene. Too late. And when she answered, Karen's voice came through so shrill that even those around her could hear. "You stay where you are. Don't say a word. They can't touch you. I'm on my way." And Ethan felt the cord tighten for them all. The ATV was dented and the chain guard twisted and oil bled like black syrup into the ditch, and he wanted to sit and cradle the bruise of it as if machines could feel insult. But he had to stand under the thin net of the law and let it be sorted. When Karen arrived, when her car screeched in and she stepped out with that armor of rage that parents wear when love makes them unreasonable, when she started talking fast and loud about how her daughter had the right to ride her toy because it had been left on community property, how the HOA had special provisions, how she would sue, how she would have every badge there suspended for harassment, and Ethan had to bite his tongue and swallow his old habit of making himself smaller. Officer Cantu stayed maddeningly calm, said, "Ma'am, it's stolen property. The tracker shows the movement. Your daughter's on video. This isn't HOA business." And that was when Sloan, aching and angry, said, "I told you we're untouchable," as if that phrase were a talisman that could repel consequence. And Karen, eyes flaring, set a hand on her daughter's shoulder as if to shield her from physics. It could have gone another way, with a warning and a lecture and a parental promise that would be broken by Sunday. But Sloane's attempt to climb back onto the ATV while officers were looking at it, her refusal to give her name, her shove at a cop's arm, small, but enough, sealed an outcome she hadn't imagined. And as the girls with phones filmed and posted, as the boys shifted from foot to foot in the way of animals trying to smell the direction of threat, Sloane was handcuffed and put into the back of a patrol car, her mouth shaking and her cheeks blotched with the red of a child who has been caught, and Karen's fury turned combustible. She stepped into the space of the closing door, and when Officer Cantu told her to back away, she pointed a finger at Ethan and said, "You vindictive little man, this is your doing." And there it was again, that urge in him to be contrite, to apologize for being, but he straightened and said, soft as the bare edge of a blade, "No, Karen, this is your doing." And those words landed with an honesty that made even the teenagers blink, because truth spoken plainly in communities built on decorum has a way of cracking plaster. It was late when Ethan pulled his wounded ATV home on a borrowed trailer, Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Dupree from 3 doors down, helping him guide it with gloved hands. The night smelling of crushed weeds and the residue of someone else's disaster. And as they bent to lift and brace and coo over the bent chain guard, he was surprised by the churn of grief that rose in him, not just for the machine, but for the way the neighborhood had become a theater of someone's unchecked power, for the remembering that a symbol of his father could be yanked and joy-ridden by a child who held no value for it, because nobody had taught her how to measure value. He slept badly and woke early, fingers tracing little circles on the sheet like a man feeling for a pulse in a dream. And when he stepped outside with his coffee and the light had that tender, forgiving quality before the dignity of day hardens everyone's posture, he caught Karen across the street dragging her garbage bin down the curb with more violence than necessary. Her eyes swollen with a night that ate her, and she spat in his direction, an action so beneath even her careful image that he felt more pity than anger. By noon, 2 different versions of the story had bloomed across the neighborhood. In one, he was a vindictive man who entrapped an innocent girl with a tracker. In the other, he was a patient neighbor pushed to a breaking point by an HOA that mistook itself for a court. And in the midst of the rumor, Ethan did the only thing that made sense to him. He took the ATV apart. He unscrewed bolts, he drained oil, he cleaned grout, he sanded a scuff until it was a memory. He laid each piece on grimy towels, and the order of it stilled his breathing. He knew from Officer Cantu that the charge was a juvenile one, that Sloane had spent the night in detention and would have a hearing, that Karen had attempted to throw her weight around at the station and had been politely ignored, that sometimes the machine of the law keeps rolling, because even the stubborn cannot stand in front of it forever. He didn't feel triumphant when he heard this. He felt like the ground beneath all of them had lowered a fraction, and that they would have to learn to walk again. The HOA board's emergency meeting 2 nights later was poorly disguised under the subject line, community, communication session, and when Ethan took a back chair he saw Karen at the front in her posture like a coiled spring. And he saw also the surprise on her face at how many had come, and how many of those faces were set not in sympathy but in calculation. The session did not go the way it would have 3 months earlier, when Karen's word was the riverbed everyone's water ran through. People stood and spoke, halting and polite, then daring, then furious in the way of people who have swallowed small angers until they become sharp. Mrs. Alvarez told of being warned for hanging a hummingbird feeder that dripped. Mr. Dupree spoke of being threatened with fines for Christmas lights left one day too long. A young mother talked about being shamed for chalk drawings on the sidewalk, and in each anecdote the same theme pulsed. A hunger for rules that protected had become a hunger for control that punished. When it was Ethan's turn, he did not intend to speak. He had sat on his hands, but then the words stood up in him. He kept it simple. "I moved here to heal. The machine in my garage is a relic of my father and my best memory. I followed every rule until the rules were used as a cudgel. When my ATV was taken, I called the police as anyone would. I am not your villain, and neither is your daughter. But neither am I your stage on which to play a performance of power. He watched Karen blink as if someone off stage had changed the lighting, and he thought, not without cruelty, that her costume was beginning to itch. The board took votes, the first in years that were not predetermined, and when the dust settled, Karen was no longer president. She stared at her clipboard as if it were a passport suddenly canceled. This did not fix what had been broken. Not in her house, not in the trust that had leaked like oil across their street, but it shifted the horizon. In the middle of this, an envelope arrived at Ethan's place. A notice of the juvenile hearing at which victims might speak, and he held it with determination and dread. When he went to the county building, when the fluorescent lights buzzed and the echo of shoes on tile made him think of hospitals and DMV lines and all the places where humans become paperwork, he saw Sloane across the hall in a loose sweater with her hands folded tight between her knees, and Karen with her mouth bruised by the absence of lipstick, and he almost didn't recognize them. The judge was a man with kind eyes that had learned the trick of not being soft, and when it was Ethan's turn to speak, he did not perform righteous anger. He described what the ATV meant. He described the fear that a large machine in the hands of a child can injure. He described the way Sloane's laughter had sounded like a cry for someone to draw a line. And then he surprised himself by saying, "I don't want to see her crushed by what she did. I want to see her held." The judge nodded once as if marking a tally, and after some talk and some silence, after Karen's stuttering attempt at defense that sounded less like defense than that old brittle hunger, after Sloane's eyes flooded with angry tears again, the decision was laid down: restitution for damages, a period of supervised probation, mandatory counseling, community service hours to be served, not by picking up trash alone, but in the small engine repair shop by the school, the one where students learn to make machines sing. On the way out, in a hall that smelled of disinfectant and past mistakes, Sloane caught Ethan's eye. She had a look that was both daring and ashamed and also profoundly young, and she said, very small, "It just looked so cool. I wanted to be—" And she didn't finish, and he nodded and said, "It is cool. It's also heavy." And in that strange little exchange, he realized he had forgiven her without meaning to, because forgiveness is sometimes the easiest gift to give a child who has been starved of it. The months that followed did not turn into a Disney montage, but there were small things. The sound of Sloane's laughter grew less brittle as she learned at the shop to take apart carburetors and clean air filters and memorize torque specs. The sight of her biking down the street with grease under her nails. The moment when she saw Ethan tightening a bolt on the ATV and offered a T-handle wrench without asking, and he took it and said, "Thanks, kid." And Karen on her porch. The edge of her voice dulled not by surrender but by the slow realization that she had been guarding a castle that was more siege tower than home. She began to wave at people without assessing their compliance first. Sometimes she sat with Mrs. Alvarez and asked about hummingbirds. Sometimes Ethan watched her out his kitchen window and felt a complicated compassion for whoever taught her that love meant control. One golden afternoon, when the azaleas were ridiculous and the air soft with spring's generosity, Sloane crossed the street and stopped at the edge of Ethan's driveway, as if the concrete were a border requiring a passport. And when he nodded, she stepped forward and said, "I'm sorry," and it was not grand, not overwritten, just a certain arrangement of syllables that were heavier than their weight. And he said, "I know." And then, because he couldn't help himself, "Do you want to learn how to adjust the valves?" And she lit up with the particular electricity of someone invited into a circle, and he handed her a feeler gauge and showed her how to listen, not with ears only but with hands, and they bent over the machine that had once been a trophy and now was a bridge. He thought of his father's hands guiding his young ones, corrected his reflex to be impatient and breathed. In the heat of summer, when the road shimmered and the HOA newsletter now featured birdwatching tips rather than bylaw threats, Ethan took the ATV out on the approved trail and rode it like a prayer. And on his way back, just at the neighborhood sign where the letters had been repainted by volunteers who hummed as they worked, he saw Karen walking a little dog, and they paused. The pause was longer than it needed to be, and it stretched into a sort of truce. She said, "She's doing better," and he said, "I know." And she said, "I thought, if I controlled it all, I could keep her safe." And he said, "Control is a kind of fear. Safety is something you offer in your presence." And she winced and smiled the smallest smile and said, "You sound like a therapist." And he laughed as if laughter could free them both for a second from being the people who had done those things to each other. To an outsider, this would have looked like a small story, a stolen machine, a night in juvie, a neighborhood spat. But inside Ethan it felt like something else, a reweaving. He had arrived here with loneliness wrapped around his ribs and a relic of a father like a charm against emptiness. He had been gutted and made to choose whether to close up or open. He had watched a child barricade herself with a word like untouchable, and then be touched by consequence that did not crush her but redirected her. And he had witnessed the slow, unbeautiful shedding of a woman's armor until the person underneath peered out, squinting as if from a cave. Sometimes at night, the garage light on, the radio low, Sloane sitting cross-legged with a parts diagram spread beside her. He'd feel the old grief swell and then settle into a new shape. Not smaller, just differently balanced. And he'd imagine his father leaning in the doorway with his arms folded, chewing toothpick wisdom, and he'd say out loud, even though he knew better, "You see this, old man? You see how it turned?" And in his head his father would say, "I see, son. You did good." The HOA sign still stood at the entrance, but its letters felt less like rules and more like names carved in a tree. And in a young woman's vocabulary, the word untouchable had been replaced by accountable, which had, in turn, made space for belonging, and that change, small enough to ride in the pocket of a summer dress, was somehow enormous, enough to set a neighborhood humming in a different key, enough to let a man stand in his driveway in the blue hour and feel that the territory inside his chest had grown a new room with a light in it. And when he rolled the ATV back inside, the chain new and the padlock firm, he didn't glance across the street for permission. He looked at the sky and let the evening fold around him like a coat he had finally grown into. Calm, their vehicles forming a loose corral, their voices carrying commands that cut through the engine noise. And still Brianna laughed, shouted over her shoulder something about calling her mom, about how they couldn't just do this, about who she knew. And when she tried to shoot the gap between two cruisers, her front tire clipped a bumper and the ATV slewed sideways and stopped. And in the quiet that fell, she tried to stand there as if she had meant to stop, as if every choice could be turned into inevitability with enough entitlement. But her eyes were shining in a way that told the truth. Fear had finally arrived. Evan watched her become smaller as she was approached, heard the last of the engines die, heard a deputy with a gentle voice ask if she was okay, and then came the words that made everything both real and merciless. "Turn around. Place your hands behind your back," and her face shifted, a refusal forming in a mouth that had never been taught the shape of the word no when it aimed at her. And she twisted and spat words at the deputies that came not from bravery, but from an upbringing that had misinterpreted love as immunity. And she said, you can't, you don't know who my mother is." And she called out again into the dark, "Mom," as if the trees could deliver Karen's temper like cavalry. Karen arrived, of course she did, headlights screaming down the road, tires chewing mud, her blouse absurd under the rain, her hair wild now, her hands thrown up as if she could arrange reality with her wrists. And she demanded things in a voice that might have worked in HOA meetings, where people nodded to get through the agenda, demanded names and badge numbers and why and how dare you, and she is a child, and you don't know what you're doing, and my husband is on the city's planning commission, and we can make your life difficult. And the deputy closest to her said calmly, "Ma'am, step back," and when she didn't, when she reached to touch her daughter while the cuffs were being applied, he stepped between them and said again, "Ma'am, step back or you'll be detained." And the word detained fell into a puddle, splashing everyone with the understanding that nights like this take from everyone involved. Evan stood where the rain could wash his face without asking what it was washing away, and watched a red-faced woman who had become, in her own home, a tyrant with a smile lose control of a narrative she'd curated with newsletters and fines and friendly reminders about flags of the wrong size. And he saw in her suddenly both the ridiculous posturing of power and the human terror of a mother watching her child be taken to a place where she could not smooth the sheets. When he approached, cautious, a deputy lifted a palm to hold him where he was, and he stayed put and nodded. And later, when they asked if the muddy four-wheeler belonged to him, he said yes and provided the serial number as if reciting a prayer, and they placed evidence tags around the grips he had cleaned a dozen times, and the sight of them, bright slips of artificial color against the honest filth of work, made his throat burn. In the days after, it became clear that the story of stolen property would not remain about property. It became a kind of referendum on power on their little street, a way for neighbors to say, in murmurs over hedges and in text threads that stretched until midnight, that they were tired of being managed to death by someone who weaponized rules as a way to offset insecurity. Karen, furious beyond measure, pivoted not to apology or a gratefulness that her daughter had not killed someone that night but to litigation of a different sort. She fired off violation notices like darts at Evan for his temporary tarp, for his lawn edge, for the orientation of his patio furniture, the veneer of legitimacy so thin it had no substance, and within hours of her daughter's arrest, Evan had a letter on his door stating, with impersonal formality, that he was in breach for storing a prohibited vehicle visible from the street. He stood there with the paper in hand and felt laughter lift into his chest. The sad kind, because the universe sometimes wrote satire in block letters, and he walked over to Mr. Chan's house and held the letter up and asked, quietly, if he'd received anything like it, and Mr. Chan's eyebrows curved into 2 commas of sympathy and fatigue. The neighborhood split into the kinds of factions that look like polite nods in daylight and sharpen into opinion at night. Some rallied to Karen's cause because the world had been easier when one person told them what color their door should be, but more people were tired, and they stopped waving back at her and they told Evan stories of lawn flags taken down while they were at work and of teenagers warned for playing basketball too late, and of a Christmas wreath that had been judged too large. The deputies returned his ATV after a week once they'd taken prints and photographs and measurements, returned it with a bent axle and a cracked fender and a smell like someone else's hands, and Evan wheeled it into his garage and did something he hadn't let himself do. He sat on an overturned bucket and put his forehead to the handlebar and let the animal sounds rise from his throat until Bandit whined and pressed his head into Evan's knee. The fix became a way to survive the waiting that comes after a crime when the law moves forward in its own tempo, unhurried and uncaring of the heart's need. And the garage light turned evenings into a chapel where he could pray without words, just rust loosening and grease on his hands and the earthy rhythm of small accomplishments. He had recorded the scene at the levee with the shaky discretion of a man trying to remain useful without turning his fear into a spectacle. And when he found Brianna's public videos later, swaggering under a thin layer of bravado, he flinched at the one where she shouted at the night, "Untouchable, baby," and he saved it because it was truth captured in pixels, not as evidence of guilt but as evidence of a story larger than theft. This was how children were taught to stand. Their feet not on ground at all but on air bolstered by promises someone else made them. The arraignment came and flashed and moved, a lawyer in good shoes speaking on behalf of a girl who rolled her eyes, and a mother who couldn't help hissing in the back row. And the judge spoke with a firmness that had the weight of someone who had seen every version of this, who had been 19 once himself, and then had watched 19 become 40 in other faces. And he said, "Miss Halbrook, these are serious charges. Felony theft of a motor vehicle. Reckless endangerment, resisting, do you understand?" And Brianna looked down and then up, then down again and nodded with a smallness that didn't match the mouth he'd heard at midnight. She was released on bail into Karen's care with conditions that should have been obvious. No contact with the victim, no social media posts related to the case, no driving without a license, a curfew, a leash put on a wildness that had been celebrated until it embarrassed the wrong person. And Evan let a corner of his lungs fill for the first time in days because for once boundaries were real. But the human heart, when trained to expect a certain kind of gravity, keeps rolling in that direction even after the signposts change, and 2 weeks later, when the spring sky was the color of spilled milk, and the wisteria had begun to purple the fence line, Evan found a cigarette butt ground into his driveway and a thin line of muddy footprints near his gate like a taunt. And then his phone buzzed with a DM from an account that had no face. Only a caption under a video of someone at the levee on an ATV that turned too fast and almost rolled. "Try to catch us." And the music under the clip made his heart thrash. He turned the DM over to the detective, and when the detective called him 2 days later and said, "You're not going to believe this," he did believe it because people who think they're untouchable don't stop reaching. And the detective told him Brianna had posted again, a violation of her conditions so bold the judge would not ignore it. At the hearing, Karen sat in a suit that couldn't save her and spoke with tears, real or performing, about her daughter's future and about college and about how a single mistake shouldn't ruin everything. And the judge asked, who taught her she's untouchable? And no one answered because the architecture of denial is built without open rooms. And then the judge revoked bail with a paragraph of law that sounded like metal on stone, and Brianna cried in a way that made her look like a child again. as the bailiff took her wrists gently and walked her toward the door that wouldn't open to anyone who wasn't authorized. And the sound of the latch sliding into place lived in Evan's ears for nights afterward. He didn't celebrate. He went home and stood in the backyard with his hands in his pockets and watched the rain darken the deck boards, thinking of the way power is like a mirage in a heat shimmer. It looks like water until you put your mouth to it, and then it's grit and shame. The HOA meeting that followed was crowded in a way they hadn't seen since a developer had once tried to cram 5 houses into the last green square at the end of the block. People came with printed bylaws and with shaky public speaking voices, and with the flush of bravery that blooms in cheeks when the neighborhood sees itself as something bigger than a board. And Evan, who hated microphones, stood at the lectern and told his story without theatrics, just a steady recounting of what had